Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great privilege to welcome Nicolaas Rupke here today. He's come over from Göttingen for this seminar. He's Professor of the History of Science at Göttingen. He's also Director of the Institute for the History of Science, and as I'm sure you'll know, has written very widely over many years in this whole area of the history of science. Most recently, he's edited a volume on the eminent lives in the 20th century, Science and Religion. And I was just hearing that that book is now going to have a second printing, in fact a second edition, with several additional chapters being added in there. So do look out for that book. Hasn't been enough, I think, writing by historians on the 20th century science and religion sort of debate and discussion, so it's great to see those books coming out. And today he's going to speak to us on animal behaviour and human morality in historical perspective. So thank you very much, Nicolaas.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to Cambridge and to this series. Animal behavior and human morality in historical perspective. Does animal behavior have a normative bearing on human morality? That is the issue I will be addressing. As an historian of science, I like to make a contribution to this controversial potential connection. By tracing where does this biologizing of human ethics come from? And I recently started a new project looking at the past 200 years of attempts to establish this connection. My talk reflects, I should warn you, work in progress. I've not yet published on this. But what I shall present here is a contextualizing discussion of one of the very early texts establishing a presumed connection between animal behavior and human morality, human society, culture. And I'll follow up that contextualizing discussion with a series of contrasting comparisons to later texts. I can't do all, of course, because the amount of work that's gone on in this area over the past 200 years, ever since the professionalization and the institutionalization of animal behavior studies, that's why I've taken those 200 years, is enormous. Now let me just remind you, to begin with, of the ongoing current interest in this connection. There virtually isn't a week that goes by without a magazine like New Scientist or other popular science magazines making the connection animal behavior, human morality, usually in a slightly libertarian way to justify especially unconventional sexual behavior or gender relationships. That's the most, of course, charged of these connections. But let me remind you just of not too long ago, here, comment and analysis in the New Scientist. It was a few years ago that, focus is a bit, anyhow, that there was this film bringing the behavior of penguins to bear on traditional Christian family values. Okay. Very popular in the States. And here an analysis of that in the New Scientist, hitting back and saying, watch it, if you look in detail at some of these penguins, they are up to naughty things. And that being so, does it have a normative bearing? Now, in Great Britain, where around 1800 the story of my project begins, the at the time still vibrant tradition of natural theology went hand in hand with a persistent belief in a fundamental difference between animals and humans. The Anglican clergyman and entomologist William Kirby, for example, in his Bridgewater treatise on the power, wisdom and goodness of God as manifested in the creation of animals and in their history, habits and instincts, maintained that humans stand apart from the animal kingdom by having a share not only of nature, but also of the divine. I quote, "He, man, is the only member of the animal kingdom that partakes both of a heavenly and of an earthly nature, that belongs both to a material and an immaterial world. And on this account it was that God, when he had created man, constituted him king over the whole sphere of animals with which he had peopled this globe that we inhabit." So in this exalted position, humans were to rule animals and sit in judgment of animal behavior, as had been done quite literally during medieval and early modern times in the case of these famous animal trials. There's wonderful historical literature how animals were actually tried on the criminal code in court of law. If at times animals appear to behave intelligently, Kirby asserted, this did not indicate the existence of a mental commonality with humans, but was the result of direct divine intervention, the creature being instrumentalized by God to fulfill a particular purpose. These occasions were, and I quote, interpositions of the deity by which the law of instinct is suspended to answer a particular purpose of his providence. Given that nature was divinely designed, humans might profitably trace patterns of proper behavior in animals, but the normative bearing of animal behavior on human morality continued to be kept, by and large, at a level of allegory. It was famously, of course, Jean de La Fontaine's famous The Cicada and the Ant. Another famous at that level. Now, for the connection animal behavior and human morality to be compelling, zoologists first had to accept a fundamental animal-human commonality, in particular with respect to mind. And a much debated issue in the animal behavior literature of this period, late 18th, early 19th century, was whether animals do or do not have souls, or more secularly, mind, intelligence. One of the first treatises, if not the first treatise, in which the animal-human barrier was broken down and human society was discussed in terms of animal behavior, normatively, was a book written by the zoologist Carl Vogt, V-O-G-T, a student of Justus von Liebig at Gießen. He himself was appointed professor of zoology there, but was also at the forefront of the European revolutionary struggle for freedom and national unification in Germany. His political radicalism during and in the wake of the revolution of 1848-49 took the form of anarchism, and he was forced to flee to Switzerland, where he became professor at Geneva and where he was one of the main founders of the later university in Geneva. If you go there, you find his statue in front of the old Central Academy building. Vogt ridiculed the belief that humans possess an immaterial soul, and during the 1850s he took a leading role in the famous materialismus stride, the fight over the issue of materialism, famously exchanging blows with the Göttingen professor of anatomy Rudolf Wagner, who took a traditional Christian stance. He expanded his attack on Wagner's human soul metaphysics in an essay on animal souls, arguing that there existed no fundamental difference between animals and humans, and that in both the soul, mental activity, the mind, are nothing but a collective expression of neural activities which come to an end when the organism, human as well as animal, ceases to exist. The human mind, like that of animals, is a material product, he insisted, an excretion of the organ of the brain, one of his famous statements at this time, for infants. Thus humans and animals were the same in the sense that neither possessed a mental entity soul. The question is not whether animals have intelligence, Vogt thundered during the tumultuous uproar of the revolution at the time, but whether humans have intelligence. And he illustrated his point with a book on investigations into animal states, nation states, that is. The very earnest, very pugnacious Vogt. And there is the title page. No. A little bit there is researches or inquiries into Tierstaaten, so states, nation states of animals. He maintained, his main example of such animal states were colonies of honeybees, which he maintained are monarchies, or more precisely constitutional monarchies. And he described the working of bee colonies in terms of this model. There are three castes, as we know, workers, drones, and the queen bee, but they did not represent, Vogt asserted, three kinds of bees that cooperate in a collective effort for the survival of that colony, but a divided society with on the one hand oppressed victims and on the other privileged oppressors. The workers, the bee workers, constitute a proletariat. The drones are the landed gentry, the nobility, the hereditary peers, and the single queen bee is the monarch. The workers are female bees who originate as a result of an inadequate and limited supply of food. Good entomology at the time, novel in part. And this lack of attention to their dietary needs is actually put into practice by the workers themselves, Vogt emphasized, which shows the extent to which oppression of the members of the lower classes produces compliance. It also shows that the proletariat is not born but raised, kept in its lowly state by what he called the poison of neglect. The cycle of a bee colony, Vogt continued, starts at the moment of swarming, is then followed by a period of stable existence, and finally ends with the partition of the group, two groups again. The old queen bee leaves the hive, accompanied by loyal workers and drones swarming and settling elsewhere to start a new colony. While that older generation is leaving the hive, a young queen emerges. Her first act, however, is not one of regal liberality, but of nothing other than fratricide. She scrambles to the adjacent other incubation cells and plunges her poisonous sting into the as yet unborn queen pupae or the nearly developed queen imagos. Their corpses are then removed from the cells, thrown out of the hive, and the workers demolish the empty royal cells. On occasion, two young queen bees emerge simultaneously. Would they fight each other with the help of large armies? No, the bees, being more clever than humans, let the pretenders fight it out among themselves in a queen on queen battle. The victorious one is courted by the drones. The company moves to the entrance of the hive and, leaving the workers behind, flies up in the air. What happens then had not yet been discovered, Vogt reported. But, he added, a Victoria always finds her Prince Albert. After a few hours, the company returns, dishevelled, exhausted, covered in pollen, and is received by the workers who treat their oppressors with caring devotion. The wing telegraph, again, he calls the communication between these wing telegraph, appears to transmit a message: Her Majesty has deigned to marry. Ihnen staat, Ihre Majesteit haben geruht sich zu vermählen. There we have Queen Victoria and Albert, I presume. Oh, my German fatherland, how much do you resemble bee societies? Vogt exclaimed. Gradually he turned his narrative account of the beehive into a causal account of the failed revolution of 1848-49 and into a roadmap of future activism. The solution to the political crisis was to be found, he believed, in the behavior of workers when, at rare occasions, they come to the realization of their true condition. Bees prefer the inside of their hive to be dark. And if one places a colony in a glass hive, the bees cover the glass with wax on the inside. If one continues to remove this wax, a revolutionary agitation develops among the workers. Quote, the proletarians gain insight into the situation. They stop feeding the young and caring for the queen bee, and after a while swarm into the open, living the rest of their lives in free and happy anarchy. Vogt's interest in animal psychology, as it was still called at that time, of course, by and large coincided with, and appears to have been driven by, the turmoil of the revolution of 48-49, when he took an active part in the politics of the time, convinced that the results of the scientific study of nature would help direct attempts to overthrow the old monarchical order, whether autocratic or constitutional, to establish a true democracy of what he called Volkssoevereiniteit, sovereignty of the people, and bring about political change, freedom, and the anti-monarchist unification of Germany. His book, Tierstaaten, denoted the disillusionment with the reactionary politics that followed in the wake of the brief revolutionary successes. Animal behavior speaks to us about good and bad social organization and should inform our political conduct in the case of revolution and reaction, he insisted. In his later and equally innovative applied entomological writings on useful and harmful, unappreciated and maligned animals, so pests, insect pests as we call them, Vogt returned to the political issue of animal behavior in the context of human affairs, connecting the then recently described slavery among ants to the slavery issue in the United States. Why do Christian slave owners not add the phenomenon of animal slavery to the ammunition of their defense, he queried. If God has created the institution of slavery among insects, surely humans should be allowed to imitate this, they could argue. Vogt will have known the answer to his own question. Christians did not accept that nature held moral authority over human actions. On the contrary, humans were the executive arm of God's moral governance of the world, and as Kirby had maintained in his Bridgewater Treatise, should sit in judgment of animal behavior, define some as pests, exterminate, or let others. In Vogt's view, the opposite was true. Animals, insects, had attained greater perfection than humans in matters of social organization, given the length of geological time that certain animal groups had existed, much longer than humans, they had found solutions to problems that were superior to ours. They possess all forms of socio-political systems: socialist, republican, aristocratic, monarchical. The least perfect of these dispenses with the individual, he argued, whereas the most perfect respect individuality. The debasement of the individual can go so far as to make him seem no more than an organ of a larger organic totality without free movement or independence of any kind, as in the case of the Siphonophora. That was his own area of zoological expertise. Here, the picture. Like the Portuguese man of war is an example of that. He's a great initiator of this. He was a scientist of the first order, I should say. Sometimes what I've quoted from him seems laughable, but he was not a laughable figure. He was a first-rate scientist, and although some of his comments were tongue-in-cheek at times, he was quite serious in wanting to bring animal behavior to bear on the issues of politics at the time. So here these enslaved individuals, so to speak, in the case of Siphonophora. By contrast, the individual becomes increasingly more perfect when the development towards anarchy takes place, in a process of emancipation from the state. I quote, "Anarchy steals the organs, sharpens the senses, increases mental strength. In a state of anarchy, the single individual exercises all his organs and abilities, fighting the elements as well as his enemies, to achieve in combat the independence he needs." End of quote. And a fine example of an anarchist, I quoted the clever fox, who anarchically does his thing in a self-built hole and only during a short childhood lives under parental patriarchal discipline. Anarchy was freedom, and human progress had to be a striving towards a state of anarchy. That was the message of animal behavior studies. Vogue's researches, ranging from honeybees to Siphonophora, made the animal world speak a loud and single message, and I quote, "Anarchy, anarchy!" exclamation mark. Now, we would not capture the meaning of this book by Vogt, Tierstaat and Animal States, if we were to depict this book as in essence zoology-driven, however good his zoology was. What shaped Vogt's account was his location in the cultural landscape of the time. By reading animal behavior in terms of the contemporaneous political discourse, Vogt appropriated nature on behalf of societal ideals. His was a particularly blatant instance of such appropriation, but similar instances have dominated the entire subsequent history of animal behavior and human morality. And I'll give you a few examples of that. Among Vogt's contemporaries was Ludwig Büchner, also infamous for his materialism. He wrote that book, Kraft und Stoff, Force and Matter, in which he too, Büchner too, affirmed the fundamental materiality and sameness of the animal and human minds. A fellow materialist, he engaged in writings similar to Vogt's Tierstaat. And he added, especially to the example of the bees, that of the ants. Vogt had done some of that, I've already mentioned it, but Büchner developed this to a much greater extent, because, he argued, ant societies are republics, not monarchies. And in reference to the most famous republic of all, the USA, he discussed in extenso the phenomenon of slavery among ants. However, with the founding of the German Reich in 1871, the preoccupation of the zoologists studying animal behavior with issues of German national politics disappeared to be replaced by others. And Büchner broadened his reading of animal behavior after the founding of the German Reich in directions that had to do with institutions of love, quote unquote, such as courtship, marriage, family, parental love, altruism, friendship, jealousy, sociability, and patriotism now. Much of what Büchner wrote appeared in the wake of Darwin's Origin of Species, and the basis for animal-human comparisons was no longer just the popular raw materialism of Vogt and Büchner, but a belief in human descent from ape-like ancestors. During the early decades of Darwinism, by far the larger part of animal behavior and human morality, that connection, became subsumed under new concerns, such as colonies, settlement colonies overseas, empire, civilization, and the various institutions of human society in addition to those of politics. In particular, marriage, big issue now. In Darwin's immediate vicinity was the liberal politician, anthropologist, and entomologist John Lubbock, the first Lord Avebury. In his enormously popular Ants, Bees, and Wasps, he connected insect society to human society, but more yet, he did this in other books, because what he did in this period, in order to derive insights into human society, they shifted the boundary animal-human between savages and civilized humans. And the animal behavior, human morality connection became savage, civilized combination. And Lubbock did this in his prehistoric times, and especially in the origin of civilization. So an extraordinary amount of racism entered this particular phase in the animal behavior, human morality history. But sexuality, by and large, remained a taboo subject, in many instances touched upon only indirectly by means of a discussion of more proper subjects, such as matrimony. Büchner's book, for example, only tangentially discussed love in terms of sexual love. The person to break this taboo was the redoubtable popularizer of Darwinism in Germany, Wilhelm Bölsche, an admiring follower of Darwin's Rottweiler Ernst Haeckel, a committed member of the Monist League and a central figure in the Friedrichshafen colony of sexually libertarian and liberated artists. Bölsche's major purpose as a science popularizer was to promote the Darwinian worldview as a secular alternative to Christianity. One of his strategies was to relocate human morality, removing it from its religious ecclesiastical foundations to base it on science. In his most successful book, some say it's still the most successful book of science popularization ever, Love, Life in Nature, translated, the German was of course Liebesleben in der Natur, translated in English and many other languages. He discussed human sexual mores as an integral part of the totality of sexual behavior in nature. Revolutionary. In the process, Bölsche relativized a range of social institutions, from marriage to monastic celibacy. opening up avenues of progress for liberal causes such as the suffragette movement, and at length he discussed prostitution, which he condemned, stressing at the same time that puritanical conventions had driven young men to get their first sexual experiences in the degenerate context of sex for money. Here, just that bullshit cartoon, many of them in circulation, from the German equivalent of Punch. Here, a newly met couple, here a bookseller, and the newly met couple says, "Do you maybe have a book for newlyweds?" The bookseller says, "May it be Bölsche's Love, Life and Nature?" "Good heavens, no, we do already have an apartment of our own." A misunderstanding of love, life and nature. Or maybe not. Now, this assault by Bölsche on the Christian foundations of society was parried by contemporaries of Bölsche. The oeuvre of the entomologist and termite expert, for example, Erich Wassmann, Jesuit, can be seen as the Catholic answer to the Darwinism of Bölsche and the monist League. The priest Wassmann too addressed issues of comparative behavior in animals and humans, but in his comparative studies of the psychology of ants and higher animals, and later studies, he reaffirmed the Church's position on the fundamental separateness of animals from humans, even though he had become a convinced evolutionist. Animals are not mere reflex machines, Wassmann admitted, yet they do not have a spiritual nature as associated with immortal souls, the possession of which sets humans apart. This line of argument he sustained by demonstrating that animals have no intelligence. That was the crucial issue. His very interest in ants may well go back to a critical review he wrote of the Lubbock book, translated into German, on ants, bees and wasps. A book in which Lubbock had made great claims for animal intelligence, so emphasizing the commonality with humans. Wassmann saw ant society as a product of instincts purely. Although not entirely consistent with this, Wassmann once discussed the phenomenon of non-sexual castes in ants and especially in termite colonies in terms that seemed an apologia of the Catholic institution of monastic celibacy, saying, "Look at these termites, so successful, and it is due to these non-sexual castes. We Jesuits." Same thing for the Catholic Church. Now, the trauma, I'm going to see, there are many wonderful examples, but I'm going to skip one or two because I see time is moving. But I still have one or two left before I come to the important brief question: what does this say about the question with which we've started? So the death and destruction of World War I and World War II formed the background to questions asked of animal behavior by the new ethology, in its preoccupation now with wholly different issues, namely aggression and territoriality. And the position of innate aggressiveness was argued by a range of well-known names, from the popular writer Robert Awdry to the Nobel laureate Nicolaas Rupke. One of the most famous and respected representatives of the ethological approach, as it was now called, who significantly contributed to relocating the study of animal behavior from psychology to zoology, was of course Konrad Lorenz, whose book on the natural history of aggression, Das sogenannte Böse, on aggression is the English title, gave expression to the contemporaneous need for facing up to and deal with the disturbing fact of wars between civilized nations. Humans were innately aggressive, he and many of his fellow ethologists believed, but a study of how in higher animals aggressive behavior is regulated, is managed, might help in averting future calamities of warfare between nation states. Similar changes of sensibility and preoccupation in animal behavior in ethology studies have continued. Via E.O. Wilson, Dawkins, and especially Frans de Waal today. Issues having to do with altruism, different kinds of altruism, even emotionality. It's part of my project, but it goes too far for today. This bird's eye view, for which, only for this I have time today, this bird's eye view of animal behavior and human morality does of course no justice to the complexity and richness of the full story, nor does it include the more recent preoccupation especially of Frans de Waal, whom I just mentioned. Yet, however narrow the compass of my account today, it underpins, I believe, the following argument. The crucial question to ask is, in answering our original question, does animal behavior have a normative bearing on human morality? The crucial question to ask in answering that is, has the scientific study of animal behavior given us a set of essential norms of moral conduct? Or softening the demand made on science, have the connections between animal behavior and human morality, although made by scientists, proved independent from them, not bound by their personality or culture, not by their cultural and political setting? The answer would appear to be very clearly and unambiguously, no, it hasn't. The particular link described by Vogt and his comrades in arms served and was made in the course of the ideals of the revolution of 1848-49. Subsequent generations latched onto aspects of animal behavior that betrayed the societal preoccupations and sensibilities of their places and times. Over and again, animal behavior has been made to speak a message that mediated presentist group interests. To put it theatrically, the scientist, the zoologist, appears to have acted like a puppet master, making nature speak her own ventriloquist message. To Vogt, the study of insect behavior offered a prescription for solving the political problems of human society. Nature was made a source of imperatives for reform. Moreover, also if the political turmoil of the time merely suggested to him an obvious model for his insect studies, my point remains unaffected, namely that from one space and time location to another, apiologists, myrmecologists, and other animal behavior experts read in nature different meanings, and that these invariably were meanings in dialogue with transitory preoccupations, often current affairs during troubled times. In trying to construe culture, human morality, in terms of nature, Vogt's cultural location proved of constitutive significance, and the converse of what he attempted came about, namely nature was construed in terms of his culture, by him and his contemporaries, as well as by later animal behavior scientists. As I've attempted to show, the scientific advocates of culture as nature, of of whom Vogt was an early exemplar, were entrapped in what has been called an egocentric predicament and proved to be servitors to their own prepossessions. Not unlike historians when they write about the past. We're all subject to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. We've got some good time now as well for questions and discussion, which is great. So thanks. Anyone want to kick off with some questions? Yes.
If I understood well, would you be accusing us ethologists who are attempting to explain and establish that relationship that actually moral has its roots in social behavior of animals, as if we were committing the naturalistic fallacy, that we are trying to apply nature rules into morality?
Yeah, I should maybe emphasize one thing that I haven't done sufficiently so far, and that is this particular accusation, quote unquote, that whatever animal behavior studies, ethology work, etc., has been produced and been applied to human society, that has reflected the message of the group that produced that work in the first place. So that accusation. That doesn't take away that, of course, the science involved may well be perfectly accurate. That doesn't change that. It operates at a different level. So I do not mean to say that's bad science, but I mean to imply that there is no way for science, when it takes on that kind of relevance of speaking a message to human culture, that it speaks the message that exists at a time in culture in the first place. And that has happened time and time and time again, and there is no escape from it. I repeat, the science needs not be criticized that way. Vogt did excellent work on a Siphonophora, and Nicolaas Tinbergen did fantastic work on his seagulls. And Frans de Waal in his bonobos, wonderful. Huh? So, do I take away the pressure a little bit from you ethologists?
No.
Or the apparent criticism?
No, it's not a criticism. I was just trying to understand where you stood in relation to the association that we are trying to do in explaining the evolution of morality based on cooperation and all the issues that you know from sociobiology. And I was just trying to clarify, because I didn't know if I understood it well.
Okay, yeah, yes. I mean, actually, a little follow-up question. Many of your examples, which are great examples, were from the German history of science and so on, which is good. Are there examples where you come up, I don't know, with a Japanese scientist who, do Japanese scientists doing ethology come up with different ideas about the structure of society and the evolution of morality, or some contemporary things? Did any come to mind, or some other culture which is different from, let's say, Western Europe or somewhere? I mean, it'd be interesting to see if that cultural difference played out in the kind of interests and applications of ethology, for example.
Well, my knowledge doesn't really go beyond Western Europe and North America, but there, of course, within Europe in particular, there are enough differences, national differences, that are significant. So that preoccupation of Vogt with national politics is not to be found in Britain at that time. In Britain, however, there is a much greater preoccupation with animal behavior and empire. And that connection in Germany is very weak until much later. The French are the earliest that I know of who start applying animal behavior to marriage, love, and all the rest of it. Although then, as I've said, Bölsche is the one who creates the breakthrough there, the sensational breakthrough. So there are indeed clear national differences, different settings, national settings, that lead not quite to different science, but certainly to making the connection of the meaning of that work to human affairs very different.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, Maria.
I got the impression that, Vogt and the others were sort of blissfully unaware of what they were doing, and I wonder if contemporary science is perhaps a little bit more self-reflective, or is that so, do you think, in the more recent examples, aware perhaps of
I'd say emphatically no.
Right.
Absolutely.
I thought you said that.
No. Even among historians, there is great reluctance to relativize yourself. There's always this assumption now, they did it wrong, we redefine the issues, we are going to get it right. Whereas, of course, what we do another good attempt in many ways, but always in a relative setting, because all our questions are asked. This is the issue. Our questions are asked from our position of priority, of interest, of funding, of what have you. And it is that relation to the subject matter that creates these differences all the time and undercuts the very normativeness, the essentialism of the connection that people want to establish. Whether you're right or wrong in saying, morality has evolved to and adapted and has survival value and all the rest of it.
Please.
Yeah, I was just wondering why it should be thought that there would be a connection between humans and other organisms. And are there phases? Does it begin in a phase of rhetoric before Darwin, and then a phase of reality after Darwin, when common sense is established? Where does the connection come from?
Well, it is a good question to ask. Why are these materialists the first? I think it is indeed part of their campaign to undercut religious influences and traditional institutions in society by animalizing, by biologizing those. It takes away their special status. That status that Kirby had emphasized in his Bridgewater Treatise. And that, of course, was a legitimation of the structure of society as it was, for the status quo. So if you want to break down the status quo in society, you take away that special position, and an effective way of doing that is say humans are no more special than animals. And the rest I've told you in my talk, how we applied that to the politics at the time.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Because it's a bit of a puzzle to me. You might expect that pre-Darwin, if each species is created separately, then there wouldn't be any particular rational extrapolation from humans to animal behaviour, such as we know we study animals because we think it's relevant, because we know we're all connected, and our genes are so similar, and so on and so forth. But pre-Darwin, people wouldn't necessarily have made that connection, would they? They wouldn't have seen everything joined up. Therefore, why would they have thought that ant society had anything to say about human society? Because they would have thought they were created separately or something like that. So I didn't quite see why. Again, it's sort of another side of Jason's question, really. Where did that come from? Now we have a basis for thinking, well, there might be something in animal societies that will tell us about human society, because we're all so similar in some ways, genetically and biologically. But where did the drive come from, really?
The materialists like to emphasize, of course, that we all had one and the same material origin. So they believed in the spontaneous origin of not only of life, but of species. My chapter to Napoleon, so poorly known, but that is how they thought. So people like Vogt and a whole generation at that time, I repeat, poorly known, but what they thought about the origin of species was that each species had originated independently, but at the same time, in the same way, from similar inorganic matter spontaneously, under more or less similar conditions. So there is the unifying element in the material basis and the spontaneous aggregation of the germs of the different species.
Other questions? Yes. Yes. Yes.
Oh,
Lisa.
I was just going to ask, Dawkins, he makes a parallel on the basis of kin and reciprocal altruism between animal and human morality. Now, I would say that you do see kin and reciprocity in animals, and it makes sense that to some extent that exists in in our human lives as well. I would argue very strongly that we can go beyond that, and we're not limited to that. But I do think that there is some connection which may have a biological basis. So there's a connection, although we go beyond it. What would be your response?
My response is that it may well be so, but it is the focus on it that shows what one wishes nature to speak to us. There are about 1 billion other ways of making meaning out of similarities of that kind. So why is it that we are taking these and not the others? They reflect preoccupations, sensibilities, values, programs of, agendas of socio-political action, and all the rest of it. You can get as much homosexuality or heterosexuality out of nature as you wish. What do you emphasize? Polygamy, monogamy, if you wish. So why do we get these trend connections at certain times? Or should we as students, we loved of course to emphasize the boys,
You don't have to explain it.
and different jealousies between girls and boys. As boys you would, what was it again? Oh yeah, this we did, Francis Warner, one of your Cambridge playwrights these days. He got it into one of his sex plays at the time. So the different jealousies we used to love to justify this out of nature. Namely, a girl would be equally jealous if her boyfriend had a homo as another heterosexual relationship, because to the woman, genetic self-interest lay in the time that the man takes away from her. Whereas to a man, the jealousy would be far more if the girl had a relationship, another relationship with another man, than with another girl. Who cares about the girl? Because to the man, there was the danger of not his genes, but another man's genes, and so on, taking his place. So we played with this as we wished, and as we liked, and as suited us, and so on. And this goes on. You know, this kind of use of nature for these particular interests, self-interests, or fascinations with relationships.
Yes. Question here. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. And if I just might add a point that endorses a lot of what has been said between the two of you. In the Anglophone world of social sciences, you may well know that there's a certain branch of sociology where people emphasize, they say, structures and processes for the sake of understanding how they work. But in a semi-mystical way, it's very popular to light upon the double helix model. And commonly they want to acknowledge Crick and Watson without looking to the wider teamwork that went in to that very important phase of science. They light upon the double helix to explain interdependent, independent systems that work without any known plan, work independently but feed upon each other. You can see the sort of metaphor that the double helix will bring up to mind. An earlier phase of English social science occasionally would light upon, without acknowledging the work of the Breslau man of science at the time when that was part of the German Empire, the starfish, because the arms or the legs or the limbs of the starfish have the possibility of responding independently and doing their own thing around an obstacle without direct reference to the central control. Well, Wells and Huxley in the 1920s wrote a very popularizing book, The Science of Life, and they touched upon this work from this man from Breslau. In a very important little footnote, an English sociologist have lighted on this, thinking, he's the explanation of interdependent systems that don't yet have to become totally answerable to an all-controlling centre. It's an extension of what you were saying, in a sense, that their own preoccupations, they search for the metaphors that can be observed in the natural sciences.
Beautiful.
Any other questions? Question here, yes.
I'm interested in the distinction between instinct as manifested in animal systems and will. And can animals be said to possess will in any sense at all in our understanding of the world?
I'm not the person, I think, who has the credentials to answer that. I think that is by and large a scientific question. As an historian, I could say so and so things and why. I myself have no clear line on that. Of course, the issue is an important one. Also in my story, there were groups that thought that will was essential. Of course, one of the early theories of evolution by the Frenchman Lamarck was based on that assumption. And in Germany, among the Schopenhauerianer, will was an important issue in nature altogether, and so on. So it certainly is an important issue in the history of my story. But I dare not take a position on it myself right now.
One final question, which is about social history, and I just want to pick up something you mentioned, you flagged up briefly earlier on, just perhaps you could finish with one or two comments on this. You mentioned that Darwin, in a sense, was portraying natural selection as simply either natural selection or the old kind of creationist view and so forth, and that had a certain polemical advantage, I think, in presenting his work. And yet you also raised the other, as it were, third alternative, that in fact a very common scientific way of looking at things at the time was that everything had a material origin. It wasn't created, it was actually... Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how... was this a conscious strategy, do you think, on the part of Darwin, or was he just sort of conveniently forgetful, I think is the phrase you've used?
Yeah. Well, I believe that it was a strategy on the part of Darwin because the people among whom he hoped to get his powerful followers, and among whom he really did get his powerful followers across Europe, but also in Britain, they were the ones who had sympathized with this notion of a materialistic, spontaneous origin of species. I think had Darwin chosen to fight that, I think he would have gotten into a clinch with, firstly, very many important people whom he might not have defeated, and secondly, have lost a potentially important group of followers who indeed turned to him after he had published his Origin of Species without attacking them. And he created, together with these materialists, the new common enemy of creationists. So that's how I see that particular development at the time.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's I'm always fascinated by sort of social history as a scientist, and as a scientist makes you want to ask yourself, why are you doing certain things today? And I think we can learn things from history in that way. So let's thank Nicolaas very much indeed for a great talk.